Hey there, it's your history teacher, Mr. Terry, back with another History Teacher X video. All right, we're heading back to Hakim, and this video sounded interesting. It's called There Was Never a Hitler-Stalin Pact. So this is obviously in response to the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, which was a pact signed by Germany and the Soviet Union on the eve of World War II. So it looks like Hakim, who's a socialist, has got a take on this, and I'm interested to hear what he has to say. This original video is going to be linked down below. Please support that, give it a view, like, subscribe to his channel, and like this video, and sub if you want more like this. All right, let's get started. All right, so a lot of people like to use this pact as a way to kind of make the Soviet Union not look like such good guys, because how could you, work with Mustache Man, like that. But then usually a counter argument I hear, which is very fair, is like, well, what about the appeasement deals? Pretty much everyone in Europe had some kind of pact leading up to the war with the no Germans and Mr. Mustache Man. So I wonder if that's going to be kind of part of his thesis, or although his title is There Was Never a Pact. So I want to see kind of what this is. If he's saying it's never really a pact, or maybe it's been misinterpreted. Again, I wouldn't be surprised to, for him to bring up the appeasement deals. We'll see what's going on. All right, is this the book he's kind of referencing?
We hear a lot about a supposed Hitler-Stalin pact, and much noise is made trying to link, by extension, two wildly differing ideologies and nations together through some forced horseshoe theory nonsense.
That's true. So like, saying they're actually very similar. When people like to say fascism and like communism or whatever are like, the same thing, or very close. Like this is supposed to like be evidence of that.
If you're unaware, the horseshoe theory claims that the far left and the far right,
eventually
rather than being at opposite and opposing ends of a linear political continuum, are instead incredibly similar. This is the sort
not
of
fully connected, but yeah,
you expect from so-called liberals who consider themselves enlightened when doing their both sides are bad shtick.
Right.
Historically, the so-called liberal center has always immediately sided with the far right when it came down to it, while the far left was the only one to have any real form of successful and organic resistance. But that's not why I'm here today. Let's discuss the Molotov-Ribbentrop
He had to sneak that in, huh?
Note, the USSR and the Stalin era specifically was an incredibly nuanced episode of history. There are no great men, history is made by people and material conditions. Actions aren't taken in a vacuum, but instead are affected by real deficits and changes as they occur.
Sure. That's one of the biggest things I've really kind of come away with over the last, I guess, few weeks, when I've really started to cover things more like this, both from like Hakim or Metatron, or like the idea of these political movements that happen, no matter where they are, political or economic movements that happen, have to be judged not with other countries, but what was going on before in their own country. So looking at more cause and effect rather than a compare and contrast with other places.
Very rarely does something in history happen because someone is crazy, whatever that means. Much more commonly, we're simply missing or refusing to investigate the context. You don't have to like the USSR to be fair to the conditions it found itself in, nor do you need to agree with the actions taken just because you can understand why a certain action was taken.
Right.
Broaden your mind a little.
You might be like, well, Russia should have like become like the United States did. Well, like you look at like for Russia, what's going to work for them may not work for other places because of what was going on before. They were feudalistic right before that. So I'm not necessarily saying the revolution and the product of it was the best case scenario of best case outcome, but it is measured based on what they had before. You can't compare two different states and like, hey, this one's successful and this one isn't. Therefore, the one that's successful should be the model, because they all have different contexts.
Insult your intelligence and be better than those that lap up the laziest pop history propaganda. Let's get started. A frequent trope we hear is this. The 1939 Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was a military alliance between the USSR and Nazi Germany. This framing usually follows attempts of paralleling the USSR and Nazi Germany, and by extension, socialism and fascism.
He's totally right. This is a totally, it's not non sequitur here. It's like, yeah, just because, and even military alliance, he's saying is what we were told, not really what it was. It was a non-aggression pact. They both had different ideas about former territories of their homelands, right? With the Russian Empire having once extended all the way to Poland, and then Germany also expanding to Poland, having citizens there, whatever it is. But going back to what the shape of those old empires were. But the kind of thing we're told about that, or at least, probably we're told, was that this non-aggression pact wasn't them necessarily teaming up, but it was basically an agreement to do these certain things, and they agreed, right, to partition Poland. So basically, territory all the way up to mid Poland, and each other would not sort of mess with each other. Okay, so Germany, Soviet Union would not try to infringe on each other there.
In an ideological attempt at painting a certain strand of liberalism as apart and somehow more legitimate to the concepts of integrity, quote unquote, being on the right side of history, etc., than socialism.
A tool to prop up liberalism.
Used against fascism and is intended solely to paint socialism in a bad light. I wonder why. Let's give some general background information. Soviet Russia and the subsequent USSR, having only fairly recently won a short but brutal civil war with Tsarist forces and invasions by many foreign powers, oriented
15 years by then.
Germany in the mid-1920s. Two lesser-known treaties, the Treaty of Locarno and the Treaty of Special Relations with Berlin, helped shape that Soviet foreign policy. The Treaty of Locarno, between the main European belligerents of World War I, sought to establish a lasting peace, which Soviet Russia would generally benefit from, since the country was so utterly devastated by the Great War and the Civil War following the October Revolution.
So for the Soviet Union, their perspective is they are dealing with so much on their own, they don't want to have to deal with not just Germany, but everyone else in Europe. So it's like common sense that they would want to do that because they got so much to do on their own to sort of pick up from the cataclysm that was the Russian Civil War.
However, the USSR viewed the treaty with suspicion since it appeared that Germany was joining an anti-Soviet bloc. The other treaty, that of special relations with Berlin, was meant to assuage these fears by being a 5-year treaty with Weimar Germany, in which they would be neutral in the event that either country was attacked by a third party.
I always thought that like timed treaties were kind of like weird to do that because it just seems like you're just like, okay, what you're actually with this treaty is just intentionally going to use that time to build up something. So when that 5 years is over, something hostile is going to happen. It doesn't like, I don't know, it doesn't like quell my fears when I see a timed treaty. It's like, why do we got to time it?
Unfortunately, the optimism for long-term peace wouldn't last long. In the late 1920s, the Nazis began their rise to power, which infamously culminated in the appointment of Hitler as the Chancellor of Germany in 1933. The rise of the Nazis caused the USSR to refocus its foreign policy efforts to combat this threat. The policy, which came to be known as collective security, attempted to strengthen relationships with France and Britain in an attempt to isolate Germany. Meanwhile, the fear of Western leaders' imaginations and the interests they served led them to irrationally fear the spread of communism and were reluctant to enter into diplomatic relations with the USSR lest they catch the communist virus. Instead, the West decided that appeasing the Nazis would be a better strategy, and we all know how that turned out. As a result of this reluctance on the part of the West.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of those treaties were before when you really see what the no Germans were going to be doing. A lot of people would be like, all right, maybe in hindsight, that wasn't a good idea to do that, but hindsight doesn't matter.
The USSR was forced to fend for its security alone.
Right.
Back to the video in just a second.
They had no allies.
Male
no allies in the
region. Is a genetic condition that affects 2 out of every 3 guys by the time they're 35. Get professional care for hair loss from the comfort of your home without ever visiting a doctor's office or pharmacy.
I need it yet? I do have this.
I'm currently a hospital doctor, but a million years ago I worked within family medicine and met the occasional patient hoping to get treatment for their hair loss. That's where services like Keeps come in.
Right here.
Keeps is a convenient hair loss treatment where you can complete an online consultation to get matched with a provider who will tailor a treatment plan, if medically appropriate, to address your hair loss concerns. How exactly? Well, Keeps products are formulated using certain treatments that are FDA approved, have shown clinical results, and are in regular clinical use.
I guess.
All treatment plans are personalized to address your unique needs and recommended by a licensed medical professional specially trained in men's hair loss. Treatment is delivered right to your door on your schedule, with flexibility of 3, 6, and 12-month delivery options. Plus, you can adjust, pause, or cancel your plan at any time.
I'm okay up here. I don't have that thing.
Stimulate hair growth,
it was just a little bit.
Care of the hair you have. Keeps has you covered. Most Keeps men notice results within 6 months of starting treatment. So what are you waiting for? Go down to the description and click my link for a special offer. Individual results may vary, of course.
Use it for facial hair?
Thanks to Keeps for sponsoring this video. Hair loss stops with Keeps. For a special offer to get started, go to keeps.com/Hakim or click the link in the description. That's keeps.com/Hakim.
Now I'm self-conscious after watching that.
Now let's get to the background of the pact.
So what he was saying was the Soviet Union felt as all of these states, capitalist Western states, were seemingly making alliances that they were further dividing themselves from the Soviet Union, feeling like they had no allies now.
The Treaty of Non-Aggression between Germany and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, more commonly known as the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, so named for the signatories of each government, the Foreign Minister of Nazi Germany at the time, Joachim von Ribbentrop, and Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov. The agreement was simple, if one ignores the secret provisions. It straightforwardly lays out a 10 to 15 year period of mutual neutrality in which neither country would commit aggression against the other, support or provide aid to a third party committing aggression against the other, among stipulations regarding peaceful solutions to disagreements between the respective countries. However, there are 4 so-called secret provisions, and the famous partitioning of Poland isn't among them.
Okay, so yeah, this is where I'm interested to see it. So, or to see what he has to say, because that's really been the thing that people refer to with this, is because within a week after signing it, you're going to see these invasions start to take place towards Poland. So, but yeah, there's this start was not supposed to be on paper, but it was like the stuff you just saw was to basically set the grounds for what it's really about. That's again the narrative that looks like he's trying to debunk. But that they were both just trying to practice, their forms of imperialism.
That is part of the mythos surrounding the agreement and serves the purpose of demonizing the USSR, as well as deflecting blame from the Allied Western powers' appeasement of Hitler and the Nazis. The article that is misconstrued as Stalin working with Hitler to split Poland in half territorially for the same expansionist ends actually states something quite different and reveals the true Nazi intentions, which we'll discuss in the next section. Suffice to say, it takes quite the quirky reading of the article to come to a conclusion as outlandish as Stalin conspiring with Hitler to split Poland. It takes an equal amount of audacity to repeat this nonsense as historical fact, but that's a
What about the fact that that's what happened, though? And those provisions and those parts of the deal are what allowed it to happen? Is that what's more important, was, what happens as a result of it, or just what was in it? Because we saw what happened with it. And without that pact, it could have been really bad between the Germans and the Soviet Union, because those are both signs of aggression. And now they have a deal to do these things and not step on each other's feet.
Conversation for another time. All right, let's get into more detail.
So see if it really matters that it was in it or not.
That the USSR actively pursued overt military alliances with Britain and France in a policy known as collective security. One such offer, made just 2 days before the war began, had the USSR sending 1 million troops, artillery, and airborne forces to help stop Hitler if they agreed to the pact. Such a pact would have drastically altered the course of history. Unfortunately,
that is never talked about. Interesting addition there.
Both Britain and the pact. Such a pact would have drastically altered the course of history. Unfortunately, both Britain and France declined the offer, forcing the USSR to operate unilaterally without Allied support. With the
you got to understand. You understand. People were way more afraid of the Soviet Union and Joseph Stalin than they ever were of the no-no Germans or Mustache Man. We know that in the United States as well in the West. This is a first Red Scare. They were very fearful of that.
Policy not bearing fruit, the USSR decided the next best course of action was some kind of treaty with Germany that would delay the war machine the Soviets knew were coming for them. Soviets understood that the West's appeasement policy that had resulted in the annexation of Austria and Czechoslovakia was a failure and prelude to an expansionist war by Germany, and that Poland was in Germany's crosshairs next. The Soviets sought to buy as much time to prepare and therefore was left with the unenviable position of having to sign a non-aggression treaty with Germany in order to provide for the security of the USSR and her citizens. All this is also forgetting that the USSR was the last country to sign a non-aggression pact, after Poland and France and Belgium, the Baltic countries, amongst others.
This is one of the best points you can make from this perspective, is the fact that, the Soviet Union was the last to make a deal with Germany. And so you can't really criticize them for making a pact when, in fact, that is what had been going on for years before that. I do think that's a very fair point.
That's always never mentioned. I wonder why. If you think this explanation sounds conspiratorial or is calling me propaganda, then consider that this explanation was common as early as 1943 when
nothing yet is conspiratorial.
The USSR Joseph Davies was interviewed about various topics regarding the USSR. In his response to the fifth question about the USSR's opaque foreign policy, he said, in part, and I quote, "When they, the Soviets, lost faith in both the will and the capacity of the Western democracies to join them realistically to stop Hitler, they still tried to maintain their security and their peace by entering into a non-aggression pact with Hitler in 1939. This was not a pact for mutual offensive against Germany's enemies." And
now there's plenty of accusations you can make, because like Berlin conference and stuff like happening was already after years of breaking of agreements from the Treaty of Versailles. You're also going to see like Anschluss and then into the Sudetenland, like they were making a pact after they already saw the aggression of Germany. I think that's very fair to criticize, I guess, the West of. But at the same time, remember, context here is so important. This is Great Depression, okay? Post World War I. Last thing that a lot of these countries want is war. They were willing to give into stuff like this a lot more than you saw with World War I. I mean, if any of those actions that the Germans did, again, like going to the Rhineland, Austria, etc., if that had happened like before World War I, or an aggression even close to that, World War I easily would have triggered. I mean, look what ended up triggering it, how lame the reasons were for when World War I actually started, without going into all the details with the assassination and declarations of war and stuff. So you could see how the last 20 years have shaped all of these decisions being made in the 1930s, especially by the West, but also by the East. But with their relationship being more within themselves about this new country, I guess you would say, with the Soviet Union, trying to find their place in the international community.
In that particular, it provided only that neither would attack the other. They gained precious time, which they feverishly employed to protect their security against the inevitable Nazi attack. This isn't the only mention of this explanation in the same issue of Time. Calling the USSR, and I quote, realistic, it backs up the claim with the following. She, the USSR, had been the greatest advocate of collective security. But when she saw that the democracies would not support that policy, she turned completely around and gained time to prepare herself by signing a pact with Hitler. The third mention is brought up in a larger context of other treaties and agreements the USSR had entered into prior, including their acceptance into the League of Nations. A lot of presumptions there. Under the aegis of then Foreign Commissar Litvinov, the USSR tried to establish collective security as a method of thwarting the rising tide of fascism. But the League of Nations collapsed, and was followed by appeasement at Munich, the Soviet-Nazi Non-Aggression Pact in 1939, and the entrance of the Reds into the war when Hitler invaded them on June 22, 1941. By now it should be crystal clear that the narrative that resulted from Cold War distortion is in blatant contravention of the facts.
So is he saying that is an apologetic for what the Soviet Union did with invading those territories up to Poland because it was seen as a defensive measure? I mean, it's the same thing Stalin's going to say after the war with the Iron Curtain and why he believed the Soviet Union was justified in being able to maintain a presence, from the borders of Russia and now their new alliances with the Soviet Union. It was defensive, and there was plenty of good arguments, I guess, from the Stalin perspective for that. His big thing was, hey, Russia has been invaded now twice by the West. We should be able to do these things. But we also see what the horrifying things that also happen when the Soviet Union is going to invade Poland and things like that. So I don't know if it's kind of like an apologetic for what the result of Molotov-Ribbentrop is going to be, which is a brutal occupation here in the name of defending itself against fascism.
The fact the USSR signed with Germany wasn't a military alliance.
But we'll see.
Maybe
not.
Of buying time to prepare for the easily anticipated invasion. Related to the military alliance myth is the claim that Stalin conspired with Hitler to partition Poland between Germany and the USSR in one of the secret articles of the pact brought by the Germans, specifically secret article number 2. If you read through it, it's fairly clear as to what Germany's true intentions were. The most obvious happens to be in the first line of the article. In the event of a territorial and political rearrangement of the areas belonging to the Polish state. This is a rather long-winded and euphemistic way to describe an invasion. The phrasing really betrays what the Germans want to do and then presents them in the treaty as a pure hypothetical.
Okay, I want to read this because he's interjecting some valuation on these terms. But in the event of a territorial and political rearrangement of the areas belonging to the Polish state, the spheres of influence of Germany and the USSR shall be bounded approximately by the line of the rivers Narev, Vistula, and Sen. Okay, in the event of territory and political agreement, all areas. I don't know if his conclusion follows this statement, though, of what he's assuming. What do you guys think?
Also, remember, this is a secret provision of the treaty, which only serves to further make clear that Germany was starting in Poland in what had till then been a series of easy, albeit diplomatically draining, annexations via the appeasement by Western powers.
But wasn't the Soviet Union also looking to get into Poland here too? Because he's talking about creating your own sense of security. It sounds like both we're going to do this. This was always it. And with this, I mean, it was supposed to be a defense against, if he's saying it's supposed to be a defense against the fascists out west, that really didn't work very well because the Germans smashed in 2 years after this, basically after this happened, smashes in a way that a lot of people say the Soviet Union was totally unprepared for. If the argument here is that Stalin was, correctly anticipating a German invasion, did they do very good at it? Shouldn't it have been better if they truly did think this was going to happen? I don't know. Thoughts as I'm watching this?
After all, while the Germans made it obvious that they were bent on expansion, they still wanted to have the veneer of plausible deniability. They soon used another euphemism for invasion as well, since the existence of an independent Polish state is implied to be in the hands of the
Germans did make a lot of bullcrap excuses for stuff they
did. The Polish people themselves.
Yeah.
Poland was unfortunately really affected by anti-Semitic conspiracies in the form of Judeo-Bolshevism, the extremely stupid idea that Jewish people were overrepresented in and thereby controlled the Soviet government. This anti-communist sentiment was a
there's history for that. There's a reason why there are so many Jewish people east of Germany. They had been largely thrown out of Western Europe in years leading up to this. Okay, specifically in the Middle Ages. But then, of course, things getting bad because you had the awful pogroms also happening for the Jewish community in Russia.
A powerful guiding force in the Polish foreign policy. Obviously, shunning the possibility of an alliance with the USSR, Poland sought to force strategic military alliances with Britain and France to guard against a Nazi invasion, and signed a mutual defense pact only months before the invasion would actually occur.
Well, yeah, Poland's going to attribute their independence to the League of Nations run by these Western nations. So naturally, they're going to have more of an alliance with the West than they did with the East.
In this context, Stalin had to make a difficult decision about how to best allow the USSR to survive the oncoming assault, which would be called Operation Barbarossa,
which is to invade.
Additionally, the notion that Stalin was secretly planning a joint offensive with Hitler in order to partition Poland hasn't really been substantiated. If you look at the order of events, the reaction of the Soviet leadership, and the actions of the Red Army, which we're going to talk about in a second, you clearly see that this was not the typical actions of a conquering army. Stalin's focus on invasion threat from Germany and the time he was trying to buy to thwart one was only in regard to the USSR, not Poland. Of course, he only cares about his own nation. The USSR leadership was absolutely blindsided by the Nazi invasion of Poland. It occurred only 1 week after signing the pact, and only 1 day after.
But wasn't Hakim saying though that they signed this pact and they invade a month after the pact made in 1939? Invasion doesn't have in 1941 that it was used to be defensive, but then also saying it was a surprise. So I don't know, which was it? A surprise, or was this hypothesized?
The Supreme Soviet approved it. These are not the actions. Occurred only 1 week after signing the pact, and only 1 day. Absolutely blindsided by the Nazi invasion of Poland. It occurred only 1 week after signing the pact, and only 1 day after the Supreme Soviet approved it. These are not the actions of a state anticipating a joint offensive. Just to be clear, the USSR leadership understood Hitler was planning on invading Poland, but not so immediately and so blatantly. Due to them being caught off guard, the Soviet invasion of Poland not only happened days after the Nazi invasion, but was hastily and poorly organized. The Red Army was still devastated from World War I and the Civil War. Much of this.
So you're saying they invaded Poland because it was days after the Germans that they weren't going to invade Poland? Is that the idea here? I feel like I need to see some more evidence, especially when they already decided on the lines, like he was saying.
The Soviet efforts at the time had been focused on improving the lives of people and rebuilding the country. In fact, Polish citizens were often very surprised that the Red Army was so deprived, as far as armies go at the very least. Citizens mentioned that they were malnourished or poorly clothed, that they were foul-smelling because of a tar that they used in their footwear, as well as mentioned how Red Army soldiers were fascinated by objects that Polish peasants found commonplace. Again, not surprising for a nation that had just started its first round of industrialization.
Correct.
Practically all the areas the Soviets would go on to quote-unquote occupy prior to 1941 either were part of the post-Tsarist political structure or had their own episode of the Bolshevik Revolution, which happened to be defeated either by white armies, for example Finland in the Civil War, or German World War I policy, specifically Brest-Litovsk. Okay, so if the USSR didn't conspire with the Nazis to partition Poland amongst themselves, then why did the USSR invade Poland? There's plenty of sources.
I don't know. I still am not convinced, and maybe I should be convinced that this wasn't a pact to split up Poland. I haven't been convinced up to this point. I see his arguments, but I just don't know if they're strong enough. Am I alone in this? What do you guys think? Everything he's talked about thus far.
Didn't conspire with the Nazis to partition Poland amongst themselves, and why did the USSR invade Poland? There's plenty of sources that already focus and almost exclusively mention the many unjustifiable mistakes committed by the Red Army, as with any army, of course. But this overemphasis really only serves as a way for liberals to equate the communists and Nazis, which is an ideological pool with the depth of a puddle. Let's take a look into the nuance.
Okay, so he set it up, if you didn't catch there. He's not fully supporting what happened with the invasion of Poland here. Okay. By the way, let's not forget the Baltic states, too. I think this is also getting very fixated on Poland.
The USSR leadership's original justification given for the invasion of Poland was to regain lands lost in the Treaty of Riga, which concluded the 1919 and 1921 Polish-Bolshevik War. Ukraine and Belarus, then a part of the USSR, were invaded by Poland in their attempt to re-establish the borders of the Polish Empire of 1772. In the treaty, the Polish border was established by Britain and the US at 200 miles east of the Curzon Line. However, due to the march of time and the migrations of people that occurred during previous eras, the lands acquired by Poland were no longer ethnically Polish, but were mainly Ukrainian and Belarusian. Therefore, Poland was seen as an occupier or colonial power even in these regions by minority groups. The motivations to invade Poland expressed by the Red Army, however, were quite different.
I mean, that's fair. I mean, yeah, Poland did have a lot of ethnic groups there. It just shows once again about how when foreign powers make up the borders of things, how bad they do as a job of it. Look at what happened in the Middle East after the Ottoman Empire in doing this and drawing up lines that don't necessarily make a full amount of sense. And at the same time, I know it's very hard to. That's a lot easier said than done to make these different borders up. But yeah, I mean, and this is something Germany said about with their invasion of Poland was, you know, you do have large German communities there, and the whole thing was that they were being oppressed.
They claimed they were compelled to counter the invasion by Germany and liberate the Polish proletariat and oppressed minorities. Now, of course, this may sound kind of two-faced, but they did genuinely believe this stuff, and the work of Kotkin goes as far as to prove as much.
Okay,
the Red Army used slogans of class emancipation with national liberation, which caused confusion amongst the various minorities who had their own interests and scores to settle with Poland. While the Soviets intended to rescue Belarusians and Ukrainians from mostly Polish class domination, each group found support for their own particular ethnic claims and or projects, of course. Red Army soldiers entering Poland, tasked with preparing local populations ideologically for the invasions, shouted slogans which explicitly encouraged the population to, and I quote, rectify the wrongs it had suffered during 20 years of Polish rule, and disseminated very base leaflets, actually, that urged Polish soldiers to turn their weapons against the capitalists, the landowners, and the military officials, which similarly encouraged the local population to assault their landlords with, quote...
So this is happening because of Polish oppression there. And he's saying like oppression of like Ukrainians. Ukraine was quite split on their allegiances in World War II as well.
Whatever was at hand, scythes, axes, and pitchforks. Anyways, as a result of this propaganda effort, much of the initial brutality that occurred in what would become Soviet-occupied Poland, or reconstituted Ukraine and Belarus, the maps get fuzzy after a while, began prior to the beginning of the
Belarus, very different than Ukraine.
Invasion proper.
The majority of it.
It should also be noted that most of it was selective, targeting only those of the then perceived as oppressor classes, such as landlords. This is important to mention given that so much attention is given to later mistakes, and this period gets unfairly lumped in by liberals, since they see mega landlords getting a comeuppance and their land expropriated as a bad thing. I don't, clearly. Anyways, the Red Army wasn't only
he's a socialist.
Substantial spending money.
I get his perspective.
Was facilitated by the ruble being declared legal tender in the occupied area on parity with the Polish currency. Exact figures are hard to pin down, but locals were shocked by the sheer amount of goods the Red Army soldiers were buying, and maybe even more surprising, doing so without haggling prices. As the Red Army advanced through Poland, a significant power vacuum pushed swiftly ahead of it. This created an immediate demand for auxiliary measures to maintain some kind of order. This led to the formation of something called the Citizens Guard, a voluntary assembly of mostly quote-unquote patriotic, rightist citizens in various municipalities. Mostly,
I feel like this is the same arguments that the Germans would have made about going into Poland too.
Local people, minor officials, that kind of stuff. And their primary function was to aid the dwindling local governments, who had by then mostly disbanded, in order to ensure the safety of the remaining population, just to maintain order, basically. Unsurprisingly, the Citizens Guard was legitimized by its connection with the prior right-wing regime, which influenced its ethnic and class structure, unsurprisingly. Despite the widespread anti-communist sentiment of Poland, many towns and villages turned out in large numbers to greet and welcome the Red Army. Not all were spontaneous, nor did all have local organizational impetus. Prior to the invasion, the USSR sent people ahead of the Red Army to organize receptions for incoming troops. The local residents, especially those belonging to the Polish and Belarusian ethnic minority groups, seemed to be prepared for the Soviet invasion, and although some were enthusiastic about their arrival, others needed to be persuaded or coerced even into organizing welcoming gestures. A crucial.
Not all of them were going to be like that. And so, yeah, I mean, he did make a good point about the diversity of the Poles there, both on ethnic boundaries as well as kind of like economic philosophies. Is there people that were supportive of, again, kind of working class liberation and stuff like that, and a lot of them also are going to change their tune once the occupation, how brutal this invasion is going to be, and the occupation of Poland is going to be as well.
Factor contributing to the positive.
Go back.
Others need to be persuaded or
coerced. I don't know if this is cherry-picked a little bit, but...
A crucial factor contributing to the positive atmosphere surrounding the Soviet troops' entry was their general perception that their presence prevented the arrival of Nazi forces, or in some places even expelling them by force. These were compelling reasons to greet the Red Army as some sort of liberator, unsurprisingly. You have to remember that along with the massive anti-Semitism within Poland, there was also at a time a fairly large radical left movement that was all but crushed and dispersed by the far right-wing government. Anyway,
well, what Poland was really wanting, though, was not like, hey, welcome in. It was like, how about leave us alone? Like, that's what they're wanting. That's why they got their independence and wanted their independence in the first place. They weren't begging for people. The ideal situation was no one invades.
Anyways, the celebrations, whether organic or not, were very
But they're caught in the middle, like always.
Comprising young individuals from ethnic minorities such as Belarusians, Jews, and some Ukrainians. They included the construction of triumphal arches, the raising of red banners, showering troops with flowers, hugging and kissing them, the usual stuff. Soviet invasion plans emphasized the importance of a proper and cordial reception because they saw it as a precursor for a plebiscite that would bring forth the political will of the local populace. With all the celebration, much of the older generation was still terrified, though. Some even went into hiding from the Red Army or worse. However, since the Red Army's approach, characterized by restraint and selective action rather than indiscriminate violence, they managed to garner a measure of relief among the general population, specifically against the groups that were usually targeted, which include officers, policemen, landowners, etc.
Depends who you are.
Army soldiers, despite commands.
It totally depends who you are. And if you feel like it's going to be that indiscriminate there, and there's going to be this full analysis when they're going into Occupy, right? Like, okay, well, are you, how do you sympathize on your racial evaluations and your socioeconomic sense, like going through and trying to like parse all this out? I have a hard time believing that that kind of distinguishing amongst the people by these invading forces on both sides was really happening. Hey, Future Terry here. Wanted to interject something in as I was looking through this. I want to make sure I added a point here, and that is when comparing the occupations of West and Eastern Poland, the situation is going to be especially hard. Of course, you are a Jewish person. Jewish population in Poland is a huge percentage, and having to experience the Holocaust here in the West is going to make things even worse than it could be if you were somebody that didn't have that identity that was being invaded here by both sides. So we got to make sure that we can distinguish that when talking about comparing the occupation in the West versus the occupation in the East, and trying to use that as some kind of evidence about, I don't know, the nefarious activities, I guess, that came as a result of Molotov-Ribbentrop. All right, back to it.
The contrary, usually did engage with locals and establish some sort of cordial relationships. After the Red Army established control over the areas they occupied, they embarked on local governance, of course to maintain order, but also to help channel it towards the provisioning of the Red Army, arresting reactionary societal figures, preparing the elections that were upcoming. For the next 20 months, the region that the Soviets occupied experienced a heavy dose of electoral politics. There were 3 different elections, 2 of which were within the first 6 months of the occupation. The United States didn't bother to do that with half the places they occupy, and their explicit goal is apparently democracy. Anyways, I have relevant reading recommendations that you can check out.
Bringing in the US on this?
How the USSR worked and all that. Anyone who has a proper understanding of how the Soviet system worked isn't surprised by how the Soviets operated during the
US
occupation
stayed
as it
out of
relates to
this.
civil engagement and participation. Now, it should be clear.
Well, the U.S. is going to support the Soviet Union on this. They're going to give them a huge percentage of what they're going to be fighting with Lend-Lease. They're helping the Soviet Union in this.
As to why Western sources demonized the USSR and tried to put the Red Army and its conduct on par with the Nazis. The USSR stayed mostly true to their principles during the occupation of Poland. It should also be clear just how nonsensical the claim about the Soviets and Nazis conspiring to partition Poland is. Rather, the Soviet occupation of Poland could be seen as the Soviets' attempts to save as much of the Polish population from the violence of the Wehrmacht. Unsurprisingly, there are several reasons, and not all of which were altruistic. Despite that, the Red Army and the Soviets were generally preferred to that of the Wehrmacht and the Nazis, except for...
I got to look at that more. If there's like polling and data about that, it's like, all right, who do you like more? And I still feel like it's not the question to be asking. It was, do you want anybody, like if you're a Polish person, asking a Polish person, do you want anybody to come and invade? Like, well, no, no, but it's like, they like already went past question 1 in there. So again, he's wrapping up here in about a minute. A couple things need to take place to start to understand and make a true, I guess, conclusion about his point. And I'm going to need to do it too. You know, I've learned about the occupations both by Germany and the Soviet Union and how both were actually kind of horrific. But if we're going to like tier them, who was the most brutal occupier, I want to look into some more sources because I have a general understanding with that. But to try to go and look at it from different perspectives there, I think that's going to be useful. If you feel like you've done that to a good extent, feel free to share down below about, again, the occupation on both sides there. But I don't know if either of those are justification for what happens, regardless of what these polling questions are going to be for the polls. POLES.
for a select segment of anti-Semitic Polish people and Ukrainians of Poland who preferred the Nazis because Judeo-Bolsheviks.
He's not a fan of Ukrainians,
by the population, and even though not all were locally organized by enthusiastic supporters, the conduct of the local populace seems to indicate that most people saw them at a minimum as the lesser of two evils. Doesn't make everything they did right, but historical nuance is a interesting and fun thing to discuss.
Glad he said that, but he hasn't said anything really though about the occupations themselves. Just saying it's complicated, and then moving on. I feel like if you're going to try to reverse the status quo messaging of that, then it needs to provide some good statistics. And if you really want to make this claim he's making hit harder.
I look forward to random 14-year-olds complaining in the comments because I didn't say Stalin ate Polish babies. And a final addendum, this one will just be a bit rambly. For the love of God, please don't misunderstand me. The Soviets made many, many mistakes in this.
Like
it would
what?
have been better that there be no pact. It would be better for them to have not occupied Poland. But if you were in the particular place and the particular industrialization level facing the same kind of danger, I don't know if you would have made better decisions particularly, especially when there was goodwill shown in the form of collective security with France and Britain, which would have prevented all this nonsense to begin with.
This is what people used when they defended the Japanese concentration camps in the United States too. That it was about security. You have to think like somebody living in the 1940s. You got to think about like President Roosevelt and his like situation there. I feel like that same logic has been used to condemn people, but also to be apologetics if it's something that you believe in. That, well, you just got to understand what they were going through, and it's the lesser of two evils kind of thing.
Or at least greatly affected it. That's all for this time. If you enjoy what I do, then please consider supporting me on Patreon. I really do.
All right, final thoughts. All right, so to summarize my thoughts, I think they're kind of as follows. I don't think I was fully convinced about this, that there was never this intention of going into what's going to be these occupied areas of Eastern Europe, that it was only a reaction to German aggression, because I thought I kind of heard a couple different things about that, where it was like, okay, they went in early because they presumed that there was going to be an invasion, but then also saying that the invasion was a surprise, or that they weren't going to invade. And then it was just a response because it happens, a few days, which is not very much time to sit there and organize that. But he also said the evidence of them saying that they maybe weren't going to invade what they did is that they were under equipped and stuff like that. But I think that would probably have been the case comparatively, especially to the Germans and what the German military was like than what the Soviet military was like. I don't know if that's a really strong piece of evidence that way. So I wasn't fully convinced about it. There were some other points that he made. He did make some good points. I thought one of the strongest points that he made was that the accusation that the Soviets, were basically dealing with the devil in the way that with Molotov-Ribbentrop is unfair because of the deals that pretty much every other Western nation did with Germany years before this, and that the Soviet Union was indeed the last country to end up making type of deal. And it was true that the Soviet Union was also kind of on its own, as there were a lot of Western states that did not, like Stalin. They did not like what happened with the results of the Russian Civil War. They did not trust that. There was a Red Scare going on, and that largely the Soviet Union was kind of on its own when it comes to collective security. That is all true. That is all true. And, just having some kind of defensive pact, I don't think you could blame the Soviet Union for. But where you start getting a little bit into a conversation about the nefarious activities is what happens with these occupations, what happens with these supposed provisions of these secret treaties that he's kind of arguing even exist, that the whole idea of it was just to both of them practice their own forms of imperialism and take over territories for whatever reasons they were. For the Germans, it was to protect other Germans and stop and subvert socialist movements. But then the Soviet Union coming in and doing the same thing, but just towards their values, their economic and philosophical views. So I don't know. A lot of people just kind of say that when it comes to these two different sides, that they're just different sides of the same coin. Just the coin, when you flip it, it's just going to be these different ideas about how to organize a society. So anyway, I don't know if I fully bought into it, but he did make a good case. But I know I need to look in more a little bit more, especially about conditions. But I don't know if even if I look even deeper than I already have into the occupation conditions of Poland with the East versus the West. I mean, obviously with the West, you're going to get the Holocaust, which is hard to match anything like that the Soviets could do. But if that's more of like post hoc apologetics for what actually happens there. So yeah, you can't ignore that. So anyway, all right, with that, I think we're good. If you have anything else to add, do it so respectfully down in the comments. And with that, we'll see you next time.